Welcome to our today's class, and that is what we call the economics. My name is Jafet. I'm the one who will be taking you through the economics. For those that are doing the LTD3, the unit we call it the principles of economics. It's just one and the same thing. So we'll be able to cover that. So I've said it is what we call the economics. This is a PIP college. Just in case you have any question, can reach us through that. So the unit, as I've said, is what we call the economics, or the principles of economics. For those that are doing what we call the ATD. We are doing ATD, we call it the principles of economics. Now, in our case, these are the topics that we'll be able to cover on these units of economics. Now, economics first is divided into two. We'll be having what we call the microeconomics and what we call the macroeconomics. Now, when I talk about the microeconomics will be dealing with what we call the single factors or effects of individual decisions. But now when we talk about the macroeconomics, which will be now on the second part, we'll be talking about, or it is normally concerned with what we call the large scale. Large scale, or what we call the general economic factors or the interest rates. So as I've said, in this case, for the economics, we'll be having the part for the microeconomics, which in this case is dealing with what we call the single factor or individual decisions. Then we talk about the macroeconomics, which generally it deals with the large scale or what we call the general economic factors or the interest rates. So when we talk about the economics here, the topics that I will be able to talk about, number one, is on what we call the introduction to economics. Introduction to economics. Now, on the introduction to economics, we'll be able to know what we mean when we talk about economics. Like, for example, when we talk about economics, it's generally a social science, which in this case helps us in studying the allocation of scarce resources among the community needs of an entity. So we'll be able to see how in this case the scarce resources are allocated among the community needs of an entity. So here we'll be able to know the basic elements of economics from the definition of economic, or what we call the basic concepts of economics. We know economy as an economic resource. We'll be able to know what generally it means. We know economics gives rise to what we call the human wants. It will give rise to scarcity. It will give rise to what we call the opportunity cost, what we call the production possibility curve, and so forth. Those are generally on what we call the basic economic concepts. And as we know, we will be continually be able to realize for something to be an economic resource, it has to be scarce. The scarcity is what we say it is not enough, which now gives rise to the limitation. Out of the limitation, it will give rise to what we call the opportunity cost. When something is scarce, it will give you an opportunity to choose, where in this case, we'll be talking about the scarcity and choice. Then afterwards, we'll now be able to know on what we call the production possibility curve. So we'll be able to know how the economics is divided. We have said we divide it into two. we talk about what we call the microeconomics, and we'll also talk about the macroeconomics. Then afterwards, we'll also be able to know what are the methodologies of economics. Methodologies here, we'll be talking about the positive economics and what we call the normative economics. Positive economics here, we are talking about the positive statements which are facts or factual. Normative economics, we are talking about those that involve the individual judgment. Generally, we talk of them as a value judgment. And then after that, we'll also talk of economy as a science, a social science, and then the scientific methods of economy. Generally, in this case, on the scientific methods, we'll be able to know how in this case you can be able to develop a theory. The process of coming up with a theory. And then also, after that, we'll also be able to talk about the economic system. That is basically from the introduction to the economics. Now, then the topic number 2, which now will be from the part of what we call the microeconomics. Here, as I've been able to say, economics is majorly divided into 2. There is a microeconomics and there is what we call the macroeconomics. Here, in microeconomics, it is what we call a single factor decision. Generally, it deals with a single, or it deals with the individual decisions. And that is where we'll now be able to talk about the demand. The demand analysis. This is also where we'll also be able to talk about the supply analysis. Here we are talking about demand on an individual decision. Why do you decide to purchase a given commodity, or how will you decide to consume a given product? When you talk about the supply here, we are talking about the producer. If he's selling the goods, does it, or what are the factors that in this case will influence the supply of a given commodity, the demand? And then all these will give rise to what we call the what? Equilibrium. The equilibrium. On equilibrium is whereby the demand is equals to what? The supply. Then after that, number 5, we'll also talk about what we call the theory of the consumer behavior. Now, on the theory of consumer behavior, we'll be able to know the reason behind why an individual consumes goods the way it does. That is on the theory of consumer behavior. Number 6, we'll get to what we call the theory of a firm. Theory of a firm, we'll talk of it in 2 ways. Here we'll talk about the theory of production, and then I will also talk of the theory of cost. We talk of theory of production, then the theory of cost. Then number 7, we'll also talk about the market structures. The market structures. Those are the part of the microeconomics that we'll be able to cover. Then from there, we'll also get to the part of the macroeconomics. Macroeconomics, which will give us, now, as I've said, this one is concerned with what we call the large scale. Generally, what I've said in this case is on the general economic factors like the interest rates, the unemployment, and what we call the inflation, etc. is what we'll be talking about here. So it will give us the topic number 8 that we'll be able to talk about, which is the national income accounting. How we compute the GDP. So the gross domestic product. So that is what in this case will be generally on how we determine the national income, the personal income, etc. Then after that, we'll also be able to talk about the banking and finance. Banking and finance. Is it okay? Or what we call the money and banking. So. And then number 10, we'll also talk about the unemployment. Unemployment. By 11, we'll also talk about the inflation. Inflation. Number 12 is the international trade. International trade. Then number 13 will be the economic growth and development. Economic growth and development. Those are the topics that we'll be able to cover in these units of economics. That is the topics that we'll be able to cover. So the first thing is we'll first introduce ourselves to economics. Then we'll get to the part of the microeconomics, then the macroeconomics. So I will begin with the very first topic, which is the introduction to economics. That is the topic 1. Introduction to economics. Introduction to economics. That is the first topic that we'll be able to talk about. The introduction to economics. Introduction to economics. Now, as I said, economics here is a social science that studies the allocation of scarce resources, and this is on alternative uses of what we call the limited human wants or the competing needs of an entity or of a consumer or society, etc. That is generally what in this case we mean when we talk about the economy. So you can begin by saying economics is a social science. Economics is a social science that is used to study the allocation, that is used to study the allocation of scarce resources. That is used to study the allocation of scarce resources which have alternative uses. Allocation of scarce resources which have alternative uses. Among the competing and virtually interests. Among the competing and virtually interests and wants. Interests and wants of a consumer consumer or society. Of a consumer or a society. That is what we mean in this case when we talk about economy. Generally, it is dealing with the generation and and allocation of scarce resources among the competing needs of an entity. Now, this is what I mean in the here. When I will be talking about the basic concepts of economy, you will be realizing number one of it is what we call the economic resource. And for something to be an economic resource here, it has to be scarce. And that is from the definition of it, we are talking of how the allocation of scarce resources is done among the competing and virtual interests and wants of our consumer. Here we are talking about the human wants. Human wants, in this case, we say they are limitless. You can never have enough of what you want. Sawa. And that is why we are saying they are limitless. So basic concepts of economics. The basic concepts of economics. Basic concepts of economics, or what we call them basic economic concepts. You can also call them that the basic economic concepts. Now, on the basic economic concepts here, we'll first be able to understand one of it. Basically, what I mean in this case, these are mainly the elements of economics. Sawa. The basic economic concepts or elements of economics, here we'll be talking about what we call an economic what? Resource. An economic resource. Now, when I talk of an economic resource here, we are basically talking about the ingredients that are used in production. Sawa. What in this case is used in production of goods and services is what we call the economic resource. And that is why I began by saying, for something to be an economic resource here, it has to be scarce. Are we together? When I say it is scarce, it has to be not enough. Are we together? So that is number one. Number two, we'll also be able to talk about what we call the human wants. Human wants, we are talking about the desires, the human desires, which in this case, for the human desires, we are talking about the human desires for goods or the services, which in this case, we do say that they are limitless or they are unsatisfiable. What I mean is that you will never satisfy fully the human wants, the desire for goods and things. We'll be able to talk about the same. The human wants will give rise to what we call the scarcity and a choice. Now, as I've been able to say here, the human wants are assumed to be limitless. Limitless in this case, and again also unsatisfiable. Meaning that if they are unsatisfiable, it means that they are not enough. Which in this case, it will give rise to what we call in the scarcity. When I talk of scarce, I mean it is not enough for the production of goods and what? On services. Sawa. And whenever it's not enough, you will have to make a choice of whichever you use in production of that particular good or service. Sawa. And the choice that you make is what will give rise to what we call in the what? Opportunity cost. When I talk of opportunity cost, we can define it severally. We say it is a benefit for going for not choosing a what? a given alternative. Sawa, or the benefit of choosing the next best alternative is what we call in the opportunity cost. It arises out of what we call in the choice. And then the number 5, we'll also talk about what we call the production possibility curve. You may talk of it as a curve or what we call the Frodier. Frodier is one of the very common questions, PPC or what we call the PPF. Now, to explain the production possibility curve, generally it will arise out of what we call the opportunity cost. Sawa. Now, the opportunity cost of producing other commodities, normally it increases, which in this case it will result to what we call the law of diminishing returns. Sawa. And as a result of the law of diminishing returns, you'll be able to realize that depending on the products, because here we may talk about the agricultural products, we may talk about the manufactured what? Products. So in this case, you may be able to realize that some resources may be more suitable for agricultural product as compared to the what? Manufacturing what? Product. And as a result, in that case, you get that convex curve that we'll be able to talk about here. The production possibility curve. It is what we call in a concave curve. So that is what we'll be able to know on the basic economic concept. So we can begin with the economic. Hey, Kevin, what's your question? Sorry for that. We can now proceed. A minute I sort on this. So now we can proceed. So we begin with the first one, which is the basic economic concept. Number 1 is the economic resource. Basic economic concepts. Number 1, we begin with the economic resource. And you say, let's say, these are the ingredients. These are the ingredients that are used for production of goods and services. These are the ingredients that are used for production of goods and services. Now, basically here we are talking about the factor inputs. We are talking about the factor inputs, which in this case, it will give rise to what we call the factors of production. Here, on the factors of production, which we'll be able to learn on the theory of production here, we talk about the labor, the capital, and also what we call the land is what generally we are talking about here. Now, when I talk of these economic resources, let me just explain further. We have what we call the human resource. The human resource. When we talk about the human resource here, we are generally talking about the labor, which is a factor of production. So we'll also talk about the man-made resource. Man-made resource. The man-made resource here, I'm talking about now the what? The capital. And then also we'll talk about what we call the natural resource. The natural resource. Natural resource here, we are talking about the land. All these are the factors of production. Factors of production here, we generally talking about the labor, capital, land, and we'll also be able to talk about what we call the enterprises. That is, under this topic, we call in the theory of a farm under the theory of what? Production. So when I talk about the economic resource, generally here, we are talking about the ingredients that we use for the production. And that is why I'm just talking about them as a factor input, what we use in production of goods and services. And therefore, as I said, for something to be an economic resource, in this case, it is or it must be scarce. This one, the scarcity. So just write that. For something to be an economic resource, for something to be an economic resource, it must be scarce. Something to be an economic resource, it must be scarce. It must be scarce. So that is on the basic concept number 1, the economic resource. Now we can get to the second one, which is now on what we call in the human wants. Can talk about the human wants. Can talk about the second one, which is now what we call in the human wants. Now, as I've been able to explain here, when in this case we talk about the human wants, we are talking about the people's desire that will help the people to improve their well-being or well-being. Let me just use that. We are talking about the people's desire or the circumstances. The desire for things or the circumstances that may improve their well-being. In this case, that is what we call in the human wants. And in this case, as I've said, human wants are assumed to be limitless. When I talk of limitless, in this case, we mean the people wish, or what in this case the human beings want. You can never satisfy it fully. So write and say, these are people's desire. These are people's desire for things, goods, services, or circumstances. Goods, people's desire for things. I've said these are the people's desire for things, goods, services, or circumstances. Services or circumstances. that enhance their material well-being, that enhance their material well-being, that enhance their material well-being, enhance their material well-being. Say they are assumed to be limitless in the sense that they are assumed to be limitless in the sense that they are assumed to be limitless in the sense that they are assumed to be limitless in the sense that people wish to enjoy as much material well-being as possible. People wish to enjoy as much material well-being as possible. Much material well-being as possible. And they are never satisfied. And they are never satisfied. They are never satisfied. Saying, human wants are said to be insatisfiable. Human wants are said to be insatisfiable, comma, competing, insatisfiable, competing, we also talk of them being recurrent and habitual. Current and habitual. Recurrent and habitual. That is on human wants. So as I've been able to explain here, if in this case the human resource, a human will never get enough of their desire, it means that what is there is scarce. So let's talk about the scarcity and choice. Scarcity and choice. That is number 3, the scarcity and choice. You see, the basic economic problem, this is the basic economic problem. This is the basic economic problem where resources are available to people. Basic economic problem where resources available to people, are not enough to produce, goods and services, are not enough to produce goods and services in order to satisfy the human wants. Not enough to produce goods and services in order to satisfy the human wants. In order to satisfy the human wants, you see? They are therefore said to be scarce. They are therefore said to be scarce. They are therefore said to be scarce. So you write and say also, and they are therefore said to be scarce, and therefore individuals as a whole have to make choices. I will have to make choices. Let me say, the choice to satisfy one want, the choice to satisfy one want means that to satisfy one want means that another one is foregone, means that another one is foregone. Another one is foregone. And definitely that is now what we give rise to now what we call in the opportunity what? The opportunity cost. Opportunity cost, I've said, is the value of benefit for the alternative foregone. So let's get to number 4, the opportunity cost. The opportunity cost. You say opportunity cost is the value of benefit. Opportunity cost is the value of benefit. Opportunity cost is the value of benefit. Is the value of benefit of the choice you forego. Of the choice you forego. Of the choice you forego. Or you can also say it is the value of benefit expected from. It is the value of the benefit expected, value of benefit expected from the next best foregone alternative. 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 The next best foregone alternative. You also write and say on that, it is based on the fact that resources being scarce. It is based on the fact that our resources being scarce and having alternative uses. Based on the fact that our resources being scarce and having alternative uses. And having alternative uses. And having alternative uses. Not all potential uses can be realized, and therefore, having alternative uses, comma, not all potential uses can be realized. Not all potential uses can be realized. Not all potential uses can be realized, and therefore, not all potential uses can be realized, and therefore, choices have to be made. And therefore, choices have to be made. And therefore, choices have to be made. Choices have to be made. Say, the choice. A minute, a minute. Now we continue. So I've said you also know this, that the choice to satisfy one alternative implies the choice to satisfy one alternative implies the choice to satisfy one alternative implies another one is foregone. Implies another one is foregone. Implies another one is foregone. You see, the value of foregone alternative is known as the opportunity cost. The value of foregone alternative is known as the opportunity cost. Value of foregone alternative is known as the opportunity cost. The opportunity cost, known as the opportunity cost. Now, we can also go to the concept number 5, is what we call the production possibility. Production possibility, or you may call it the curve. Production possibility curve. Production possibility curve. Production possibility curve. Production possibility curve. Now, this is basically what we mean here. It is generally a curve here. Now, let me just work on assumption. Let me assume a country like Kenya here is producing only 2 types of goods. There is what we call the agricultural goods and what we call the manufactured goods, or we can talk of them as products. So, now this is what I'm going to have here. I will have on my y-axis, here I can have, this is what? The agricultural goods. Agricultural goods. And then we'll have the manufactured goods. So our curve will be this way, is a concave. So that is what will be our curve, concave. Now, I will have, let me say, I can have these points here. Let me just start it from here. I will have, I can have A here. I think, yeah, I can have A. I can have A somewhere here. Let me have it there. B. I can have C, and then I'll have D here. Now listen here. Let me just explain it better way. Now here we are talking about the agricultural goods, and we have the manufactured goods. Now, what I want to explain is on the production. When you want to produce the agricultural goods and you want to produce the manufactured goods. So. Now, when we look at the point A and B, here it is illustrating what we can be able to produce when on both the agricultural and manufactured foods, when all the resources available are fully utilized. So what we can be able to produce is the maximum, whichever is in that curve. Now, the other one is at point C. at point C, it is telling us this is what we can be able to produce, but some of the resources are not fully what? Utilized. So. Yeah, at point C. This is what we can be able to produce, but in this case, generally, all the resources will not be what? Fully utilized. Then now when you get to the point D, this is outside the curve. This means that we require additional resources in order for us to be able to produce it at that point. Point D. So require additional resources. And that is how we explain the concept of production feasibility curve. It's always a question that will also tell you to explain the concept of production feasibility curve with an aid of a diagram. And it's always a question of 5 what? 5 marks. So you write and say, this is a line of all the combined. This is a line of all the line or locus. You can say is a line or locus of all the combined. Of all the combined. Of all the combined points. Of all the combined points. Representing goods and services. Representing goods and services. Goods and services a country can produce. Goods and services a country can produce. Country can produce. Country can produce. When all resources are fully utilized and when all the resources are fully utilized efficiently. When all the resources are fully utilized efficiently. When all the resources are fully utilized efficiently. You write and say, the production feasibility curve is a graphical illustration. The production feasibility curve is a graphical illustration of the problem of scarcity and choice. Of the problem of scarcity and choice. Of the problem of scarcity and choice, which is a basic economic problem. Which is a basic economic problem. Which is a basic economic problem. Say. Assuming an hypothetical situation where a country can produce only 2 types of goods. A hypothetical situation where a country can produce only 2 types of goods. Only 2 types of goods. That is agricultural goods or the manufactured goods. Agricultural goods or the manufactured goods. Now you can draw this. Just draw that. The production feasibility curve. Control that. Control that. Control that. Once you're done, you let me know so that we proceed. Once you're done. Once you're done, you can let me know. So you are moving, you are done. Moving, you are done. So let's just explain there. And you say, down there you write and say, the opportunity cost of producing either of the commodities, opportunity cost of producing either of the commodities, is increasing. Either of the commodities is increasing. Now, why do I say it is increasing? Look here. You can either choose manufactured goods. So if you are not going to choose the manufactured goods, you will choose the what? You go for the choice of agricultural goods. Kumaanisha the opportunity cost here, it will be increasing, which in this case it illustrates what we call the law of diminishing what? Returns. Law of diminishing returns inaelezea mambo ya production. Is the more units are used in production, the marginal we talk about the production, or mainly here we can talk of the average revenue and the average product and what we call the marginal product. It eventually declines. That is out of what we call the law of variable proportions, which is generally out of the law of diminishing returns. We'll talk about that under the theory of production. So you write, which illustrates, on that is a continuation. You say, which illustrates the law of diminishing returns. Which illustrates the law of diminishing returns. Which illustrates the law of diminishing returns. On that you can also add, and you say, some resources are more suited for agricultural production, are more suited for agricultural production, are more suited for agricultural production, and others are more suited, for the manufactured products, See, points on the curve such as A and B. Points on the curve such as A and B, shows the maximum combination of output, of the two commodities. Shows the maximum combination output of the two commodities. Maximum combination outputs of the two commodities. The other one, you say also down there, the economy can produce any combination inside the curve, such as point C inside the curve, such as point C, but this will imply that there are some resources that will be unemployed. There are some resources that are unemployed. This will imply that there are some resources are unemployed. Implies that some resources are what? Unemployed. So that is at point C. At AB is the maximum combination output, what we can be able to produce. On both the agricultural and what? the combination of those two products, the manufactured and what we call the agricultural products. But at point C, this is what we can be able to produce. But what it means in this case is some of the resources here are not utilized. So write and say the points outside the curve, like such as point C, are not achievable with the country's present production capacity, are not achievable with the country's present production capacity. Say, this can only be achieved. This can only be achieved if the current country's present capacity increases. If country's present capacity increases, thus pushing or shifting the curve outwards. Now, this is what we mean. If it shifts the curve outwards, you can include that dot as illustrated by the dotted line. As illustrated by the dotted line. You also add and say, a country's productive capacity will increase. Country's productive capacity will increase. Country's productive capacity will increase if there is advancement in new technology, or new resources are discovered, or new resources are discovered. You also add and you say, the production possibility curve, that is the PVC, is concave to the origin, indicating the concept of increasing opportunity cost. Now, let's talk of now the scope of economics. Now, this is a question that was set in November 2019. 1C. It is severally. I know even the current sittings they have set the question. Let me confirm. There is a question that is commonly tested. I will also share with you these past papers. You have them for purposes of revising, because most of the cases I will be using these past paper. So I've said is a question that is highly or commonly tested. As I've said, it was there in November 2019, question number 1C. It was there on that sitting. And recently it was also question was recently tested. Yeah, it was tested in August 2022, question number 4C. August 2022 from the CPA economics paper. August 2022, question 4C. Where you are with an aid of a well-labeled diagram, you explain the production possibility product. In that case, it was giving you 6 marks. You just explain as we've been able to do it, and you earn yourself the 6 marks. Now, we can now get to the scope of economics. Now, we have 2 main branches of economics here. The branches of economics, as I said, number 1, we have what we call the microeconomics. Which is mainly what we'll be covering. And number 2 is on what we call the macroeconomics. This is now what defines the scope of economics. The microeconomics and what we call the macroeconomics. So when we talk about the microeconomics, it definitely studies how individual or how it is generally a study of individual households and farms. But for the other one on the microeconomics here, macroeconomics, we generally talking about the bigger complex systems, which usually are referred to as an economy. Generally, here we'll not be talking about the individual households and farms. Here we'll be talking about the large scale, the general economic factors, as I've been able to say. So you write and say, economics is mainly or has 2 main branches. Economics has 2 main branches. Number 1 is the microeconomics, and you say it is concerned with the single factors and the effects of individual decisions. It is concerned with the single factor and the effects of individual decisions. 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 That is, it is a study of individual households and farms. It is a study of individual households and farms. individual households and farms. Second one is what we call the macroeconomics. The macroeconomics. 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 Macroeconomics, you just say, you write and say it is concerned. It is concerned with large scale or general economic factors. Large scale or general economic factors such as the interest rates. General economic factors such as the interest rates. Same. You see? Say it is a study of a bigger complex system. Study of bigger complex system, usually referred to as the economy. 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 Now, that is on what we call in usually referred to as. I've said it is a bigger system. I mean, it's a study of a bigger system. It's a study of a bigger complex system. Bigger complex system. Usually referred to as bigger complex system. Usually referred to as economy. Usually referred to as economy. So basically what I've said is that we'll be able to talk about the part of the national income accounting, the money and banking, the inflation and unemployment. We'll also talk about the international trade, the economic growth and development, etc. etc. So that is it on that part. Now, methodologies of economics. The methodology of economics. Now, when we talk about the methodology of economics, here we'll talk about it in two ways. There is what we call the positive economics and what we call the normative economics. Now, when we talk about the positive economics are also what we call the positive statement. We are talking about those statements that deal with facts. Those statements that only deal with the facts is what we call in the positive statements. Now, those that deal with the people's opinion or what we call the value judgments is what we call in the normative what? Normative economics. So methodology of economics. Yeah, as I've been able to say, we'll talk about two of them. The positive economics, or what we call the statements. Then the positive statements. Number two, we'll talk about what we call the normative economics. Normative economics. Here we are talking about what we call the value judgment or people's opinion. Value judgments. What we call the people's what? Opinions. People's opinions. That is what we'll be dealing with. So we'll just begin with the first one, which is now the positive economics. Can begin with that. The positive economics or statements. Positive economics or statement. You say these are those statements. Say these are those statements. These are those statements which only deal with facts. These are those statements which only deal with facts. Which only deal with the facts. You write and say they can be verified or falsified. They can be verified or falsified. Verified or falsified. Falsified by looking at the facts. 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 Say, they are either true or false. They are either true or false. They are either true or false. So what we mean is that if they are true, they are consistent with the facts. So it's just like, for example, right now we say the Kenyan population is around about 150 million people. That is a fact. So that is a positive statement. Now, this will be introducing us to what we call the science, where in this case is the scientific part of economics. Because I've said the economy is a social science, which now will introduce us to what we call the theoretical part of it. On the theoretical part of it, we are talking about the statements, where in this case, it will depend on whether it's a positive statement or on what we call the normative word statement. So number two is on the normative economics. The normatives economics. Normatives economics. Normatives economics. Same. Normative economics, same. This reflects people's opinions. This reflects people's opinions. People's opinions. People's opinions, and are based on value judgments. And are based on value judgments. And are based on value judgments. Are based on value judgments. Same. They cannot be verified or falsified. They cannot be verified or falsified. Cannot be verified or falsified by looking at the facts. By looking at the facts. Now, last year there are those the USA was having elections, si ndio? Sawa sawa. Kulikuwa na the Trump na kulikuwa na huyu mwingine alikuwa anaitwa nani? So huyo mwingine alikuwa huyo wa Democrat. Kamala Harris, ndio? Kamala Harris kwa kitu kama hiyo, ndio? Now, based on the people's opinion during those times, kuna wenye walikuwa wanasema Harris atashinda, kuna wenye walikuwa wanasema Trump anashinda. Sawa sawa. Those are people's opinion, but generally the fact was that Trump is the one who won. So we are talking about the basis of information before the actualization of that thing. Kwa pamoja. Like for example, here we may talk of now the 2027 elections that we're going to have here. We may say that Ruto will win versus the other president who will be running against what? Ruto. Although the other president who will be running against Ruto is the one who will win. Those are generally what we call in the people's what? Opinion. That is what we call in a normative statement. So that is what we call a normative statement. So we can continue. So you write and say, I've said they cannot be what? Verified or falsified by looking at the facts. And that is the normative economy. So now in our next class now, I will now come and talk about the scientific method. Now, now that we say that economics is a social science, one of the main objective of a science is to develop what we call theories. So in developing theories here, we'll just be able to know what are the process of developing a theory. And then after we talk about the process of developing a theory, we'll talk about the economics as a science, and then I will now get to what we call the 3 basic economic questions. Problems is a question that was there in the last sitting of economics. The 3 basic economic problems, we know them. Yes, that is what we'll be able to cover in our next class. Unless there is anyone who is having a question, we can just end at that point. Kunaya kuna swali? Any questions on what we've been able to cover? Or any concern? Now, this is a PIP college, generally the Pesetas College. For those that are mainly new, this is how we do our classes. We normally have the live classes, and that runs during the day and the evening. And also we provide what we call the free recorded video. Like for example, I've recorded this, which must be updated in the app so that you can have the current information. That is now what we do in this college. So just in case you may wish to join us, you can reach us via this number and I will be able to assist you. And also we'll just be able to help you to pass this particular paper. So you have a good evening. We meet from there in our next class. Thank you.